Hey, how are you?
Yes, I have a slightly hard time connecting.
You need to turn on your. I don't hear you very well.
Can you hear me at all?
You know why? Because I need to get my headphones on.
That'll be why.
All
We're
right.
professionals.
We are professionals.
Let me just switch
Okay.
something on in here.
Yeah.
Oh, that makes all the difference. That's way better.
Yeah, I need to use these because my kids might come in and scream and all that.
Same.
Okay. Welcome everyone to our first Altaya Instagram live online tasting. Our special guest today is Jeremy Seysses from Domaine Dujac. Um, there he is. Hi, Jeremy. You're at your home in Nuits Saint George?
That's correct. Yep, exactly.
Good, wonderful. For those who've been following our Instagram, you know we're tasting four wines today. But before we go to the wines, perhaps we can have Jeremy say a few things about Domaine Dujac. I know there are some new Domaine Dujac followers here, as well as some loyal Dujac followers as well. So maybe give us a little bit of background and history about Domaine Dujac, please.
All right. Well, we're in the context of Burgundy. We're fairly recent domaine because my father created it. So I'm only the second generation. And my father started it in 1968. So we're a little over 50 years old. We're located in Morey, Saint-Denis, and we have vineyards that go from Chambertin to Vaune-Romanée and now Alice in Pruning. But the core of the domain is still located around Morey. And so my father learned to make wine with Gérard Potel at Domaine de la Pousse d'Or in 66 and 67. And very early on adopted to ferment using whole cluster fermentations. And I guess at this stage, we're kind of known for that, even though we do destem some, but nonetheless, we use predominantly whole cluster ferments, which we'll talk about a bit later, but imparts a certain style to the wines. And I came back full-time in 2000, July 2000, and I've been full-time at the domaine since. We also have a domaine in Provence called Trienne. My wife Diana, her family has a domaine in Napa Valley called Snowden Vineyards, and so yeah, we're full on into wine at this stage. And let's see, in the big stages of the domaine, one of the things I should mention is that in 2001 we started farming organically and biodynamically on roughly a third of the domaine, and since then we are 100% organic certified, and we farm biodynamically as well on our vineyards or the vineyards that we have leased. We're going to be tasting a fair number of negociant wines, and that is a project I started. My father was doing some négoce, so purchasing some grapes for whites since the 80s. But when I came back full time, we decided that we would do something for reds and something closer to home and more hands-on. And so we purchased the grapes, but we have a bit more say in the vineyard, and we managed to style the wine more closely than we did for the whites. I think we're more precise in our work. And so that's called Dujac Fils et Père. So that's been since 2000 vintage. And originally the project really centered only on village wines of Morey, Chambolle, and Gevrey. And since then we've added a couple Premier Crus, and some have come and gone. Some suppliers have come and gone. And we even have a bit of Négociant Clos d'Arroche. Or rather, some Clos
Great.
d'Arroche for that label, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's exactly the point. We selected the Fils et Père because it's a relatively newer line, even though it's at its 20th anniversary this year. Because we want people to know about them. We want more people to share the passion for these amazing Negos wines. So for the first pair, I suggest we do the 17s, Morey Saint-Denis, the Domaine, and the Fils et Père, so that we can have a little comparison. I've done my Coravin already, so I've got the Domaine in one hand and my Nagos on my left hand. So these, about these two Morey and Denis villages. Tell me why do you need to have two? Can't you just blend the two and make one cuvee? Let's say just under the Nagos or something. Why did you decide to do two cuvees?
Well, originally, a few things get grandfathered in. Originally, the idea with the Negos was my father in 2000 was very far from being ready to retire, and so part of the idea was that I would have my project and he would have his, and I could, it's called Fils et Père rather than Père et Fils, which is more traditional. So it's my father says it's the son's project with the support of the father, and I can't, because I'm keen to do well. I also felt like it was, and if the son screws up, the father's in the background, and so there was a little bit of I don't know. I wanted to. I was very determined to make these wines as good as possible, but I wanted them to be mine as well. Whereas the Domaine wines were very much his, and the fact is, very quickly I was ready to follow suit with what my father did, because he's the person who taught me to make wine. He's the person who taught me wine appreciation. So in the end, they actually made remarkably similar manner to the Domaine, but they come from different vineyards, and the vineyards are farmed differently. And so the location is subtly different, sometimes more dramatically so. But the Chambolle vineyards and the Chambolle vineyards and for Dujac, Fils et Père and the Domaine vineyards are much more geographically distant. For Morey is a much smaller village, so they're quite close together. But nonetheless, they're farmed quite differently. I've talked about organic, and over time, you really feel differences coming from that. So as a general rule, the Négociant wines are quite a lot softer and more approachable. And because they are softer, I also was faster to drop the percentage of new oak on them. We've always used quite a lot of new oak, but for the village, we've gone for, my father probably used 50%, and now the Domaine wines are probably about 25%, and the Négociant wines are probably 20%, sometimes a little lower. So, so they're a little less tannic than the Domaine wines. I think they're a little bit more immediate. They're more fruit forward. The Domaine wines are typically a little bit more spicy, because the percentage of whole cluster is a little bit bigger on them as well.
How much bigger?
10%. We're not talking dramatic differences, but 10% you feel it, and especially when you combine that with the farming differences. So I think the Domaine wines honestly are a little deeper, but they tend to be organic. In our experience, leads to some reduction in the wines. So much more closed aromas usually in youth, and sometimes outright reduction. I don't think that's the case with 17 so much, but in some other vintages, the Domaine wines can really be quite surly when they're young, whereas the Négociant wines are much more fruit forward and ready.
Yeah. No, I mean, I
good with oysters, and let me just take on right away. No, not as good as Sancerre with oysters. Sorry, I'm just looking at the feed below.
Yeah. No, but you're right. As we're tasting, I definitely find the Negos wines a bit more approachable and expressive at the moment, comparing to the more minerally and more pure style of the Domaine wines. How many different plots goes into the Domaine wines, and what about the Negos?
So for the Negos wines, it was originally from 4 blocks, and now it is from just 2, and both are in the same area of les Sevrés or les Cognets. I think it's les Cognets, and the Sevrés and Cognets are side by side. And so as you're driving towards Gevrey-Chambertin, they're just on the right, and when the road, for those who know the road goes up a little bit, and they're just on the right there. With for the Domaine, there's much more diversity. There's much more different locations, but the core comes from Les Pruning, which is Les Pots is right between the Domaine and the RN74, so it's right in front of our gates. But there's some Le Village in there. There's some Herbe Brute. There's some Clos Solon. But the 80 or 90% comes from Les Pots and right in front of our doorstep.
Okay. And in terms of soil, what's the main difference between the north and south of Morey in the Village area?
They're still fairly close. They're heavy in clay, quite dark red clay. So there's some iron in there, and the soils are fairly deep. The vine age is probably a little higher on the Dujac Père, and on the Morey Village there's from the Domaine there's a real diversity of ages, but soil types. It's hard to pinpoint to a very exact location. They're too close together, and when you're walking through a vineyard, if you took a soil sample from one or the other, you'd probably be with fairly similar things.
Mm. How much involvement? How much are you involved in the vineyards at the Negos side? Do you
So
go
that's been a
and
source
visit
of
them
some
regularly?
frustration. We do visit them regularly, and the supplier from Morey I've actually known since kindergarten, so I know him very well. The fact is, though, Burgundy currently has got such pressure on the market to there's so many people willing to buy grapes that if you're a bit too difficult as a buyer, people just tell you to just buzz off and they find someone else to buy their grapes. So it's been very hard to add the kind of pressure I wanted, because I would have liked them to go towards organic, ideally, and but we're not there. These are farmed without herbicides. Actually, this year this producer is going organic, so I'm pretty happy about it. There, you got it. Just nothing like the box of, is it Dom Perignon? Anyway, so that producer will go organic this year, but right now it's up till 2017 it was not. The Gevrey has been farmed organically. The Nuits Saint-Georges Les Cras, which from 2018 is farmed organically. So we're going in that direction with the Négociant wines as well, where possible. But it's long and slow.
How about age of the vines?
So for the Négociant Morey, the bulk of the vineyards is over 50 years old, and there's a small fraction. So out of a hectare, maybe about 0.15. That's about 30 years old. So there's no young vines in it. For the Domaine, the youngest vines are also 30 years old, but most of them are probably averaging between 30 and 40.
So all planted by your father?
It's almost all planted by my father.
Okay.
Actually, I'm sorry, I'm dating myself on the Négociant wines. The old vines are older than 50. That was probably 15 years ago was true. So there's probably between 60 and 70 for the old part.
Okay. There was a question from one of the viewers. Do you ever declassify some of the Domaine wines as the Negos wine?
Not typically. There's one exception. So within the Morey Village, the guy who signed me the grapes has 2 tiny blocks of Premier Cru that would amount to roughly 1 barrel, and I buy the fruit because he doesn't want to find a separate customer for those, and so I declassify a bit of Morey Saint-Denis Premier Cru into the Morey Village Negos. For the Domaine wines being declassified, as I mentioned earlier, we make a Clos de la Roche under the Négociant label. And actually, the owner does not want to lease us the vineyards, but we do all the work in the vineyard and actually blend it with our Clos de la Roche, so it's the same wine as the Domaine wine.
Right.
And we can't be too public about that, and here I am saying it on social media. But anyway.
Okay. What else? Any other questions from the viewers?
I saw something about Chambolle and price, but I didn't have time to read it.
Yeah, we'll talk about Chambolle in a minute. Let's see. Any questions, guys?
Why does Chambolle are more accessible in terms of price relative to what? I'm not sure. Because we price them very fairly, that's why. That's, I think Paolo will attest to this.
Oh, definitely. And we price it very fairly too. Okay, from World of the Grapevine, what, if any, changes have you made in terms of viticulture in the last 5 years and why?
In terms of viticulture, we've not done any dramatic changes. We have the big change was moving to organic, but we have done a few attempts at adapting towards the changing conditions that are being thrown at us by the weather, namely hotter summers and warm springs and not quite cold enough winters and things like that. So we're trying to prune in the most frost sensitive areas. We try to prune a little later. That can help push back bud burst a little bit. And sometimes a few days can save you from frost. We are how do you say, removing leaves a little bit less. We are removing the leaves a little bit less aggressively, and to avoid sunburn. But we do also we've moved forward when we remove leaves, because that way if we do it very early in the grape's life, then the skins get thicker and are more resistant to sunburn. Whereas if you expose grapes late in the game to the sun, they get sunburnt more easily. So those would be, they're minor changes, and hedging height we've adjusted a little bit to try to get a bit more shading and things like that. That would be the gist of it.
So there was a question about different practices between you and your father in the vineyard and the cellar. I think you kind of answered the vineyard part. What about cellar? How much difference is there?
So in 2000, we had our wines were split between two cellars, and we did later malolactic in one cellar than the other. It was actually on the Morey village, and I thought that the wine that had done malolactic later was much more resilient, much more, it took to racking better, it took to bottling better. It felt like a much more resistant to oxidation wine, and I liked it better generally. So then we moved to later, we moved to later malolactic. So that was the first big change, and between my father on his own and my father with me, and then me since. Then a few other changes, which was I was trying to minimize racking to the strict minimum, and to not rack at all, and keep the wines on the lees from one end of the élevage all the way through. Whereas typically in Burgundy you would rack after malolactic, and you would keep only the fine lees, and you would take some of the lees away with each racking. And so having experimented with that, at this stage I've come back and I've decided that racking is actually absolutely necessary in terms of oak integration, and in terms of the wines clarifying more naturally, and in terms of the management of reduction. So we now rack much more systematically, at least once after a year in barrel. And then the other big change I mentioned was cutting back on new oak. I think the riper the wines, the harder it is for oak to integrate well or gracefully. So I've taken to really cutting back on the amount of new oak that we use in the wines. And I've probably not been quite as bold as I should have been. So I'm trying to really this year I'm going to just be a little bolder and push it faster.
Okay, great. Question about white wine. How much white wine do you produce per year compared to red?
So I'd say at this stage about 20% of our production is white wine. Well, that's not quite 20%. We make about 60 barrels of white, and we make about 300 barrels of red year in, year out. That's assuming no frost. That's assuming no environmental disasters.
Right. And you started making whites in 14? The Puligny in 14?
Yeah, Pruning Combet and Pruning Folatière since 2014 in a partnership. And so we don't own the vineyards, we lease them, and we have a long-term lease on them. And before that, we started making some Morey Blanc. I think the first vintage was 85 or 86. And my father had made some in the very early days, 68 or 69. He made a bit of white, and he pulled out that vineyard and didn't replant until 68, 60, so between a bit before 84. And then Montluisan we've been making since 2000 vintage.
Okay. I think there's some private jokes there. OMG, how is OMG doing? I don't know whether you want to answer that.
OMG, that's a question about my dog. My dog is called Oh My Dog. And,
oh.
that is an inside joke.
Okay.
And there was a question about oak from I saw above there. We work with one. So the question is any type of oak we use, or it depends on the toast. We use only French oak. We use almost exclusively 228-liter barrels, and we dry for a regular amount of time, 2.5 years roughly. And but on the other hand, we work with the same state supplier every year. So a lot of the oak comes from the Allier and forests that surround Paris, and we use very, very light dose. In short, how's the Coravin working for you, Paolo?
Perfectly.
Good.
Greg will not be happy if he's here.
Bottles, so I'm not an expert there.
Okay, so let's move on to the next two wines. Chambolle Musigny 15 and the Nuits Saint-Georges Damodes, both from Fils et Père. Here we go.
Which one was the 2015 Chambolle Musigny? There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. Hell of a vintage 2015.
I'm going to taste it right now. Have you tasted it recently? Ooh, it's really pungent.
Not that one specifically, I'm afraid. I'm going on memory. And so the Chambolle comes from a diversity of sites. Some comes from Frénière. There's some that comes from Chardanne. Some that comes from Herbu, Athée. Anyway, there's Nazoir, Condamine. There's 6 or 7 different sites that are blended, all small sizes that amount to a decent sized cuvée. There's a lot more in the Négociant Chambolle. There's a lot more south side Chambolle, and Chambolle has this the description in books. The textbook description is always very silky, very floral, very light wines, very light in tannin, and the north side Chambolles that come all the way to touch Morey-Saint-Denis are below Bonne-Mare. But no one ever has described Bonne-Mare as silky, and the vineyards that are below it, Les Baux, Les Sentiers, make for fairly firm, structured wines. And our Domaine Chambolle is potentially quite firm and structured because it comes mostly from the north side of Chambolle. This is much more textbook Chambolle, I think, and much more south side, has the softer tannins, the lighter structure. On the other hand, it's 2015, and 2015 was a hot, warm, very concentrated, dry year, quite similar to 2005, and which is another great vintage for Burgundy. And as a result, 2015 feels unusually resistant to oxidation and quite a lot denser than what is typical for, or what was typical. I guess we're seeing that type of vintage more often these days, these warm, hot, dry vintages. But,
yeah, I mean, this is a really strong village.
Yeah.
I find it to be quite complex actually at this village level. But one question that people often ask is, why do you keep on making the same appellation? Because you have the Domaine one already. Why complicate things? Why not make a Von Romanée village? Why not make something else?
It was partly about finding suppliers with whom we could work and trust. And so those suppliers, they let us go into the vineyards and harvest. They don't even feel they need to be there. We know them, they know us. We work in full trust that way. That's not possible everywhere. And so initially I just wanted to work with people I considered friends, and did that. And it's not that I don't have any friends in Von Romanée, but none that and this is the supplier for the Chambolle is the same supplier for the Morey. They're people I went to school with when I was a really young kid. So Whereas in Vaughan, I didn't go to the Vaughan school, so it was a different thing. And to be honest, finding grapes in Vaughan these days is just completely impossible. Now I could blend the two, but I feel like it's nice having something that remains a little bit more affordable, a little bit more immediate, and it offers something different from what the Domaine offers. And I don't want to create confusion between what are truly our vineyards and which is, 100% commitment to our ideals, our view of viticulture, and our view of viticulture and our feeling of what's right, versus a négociant wine, which is good, but perhaps a little bit more immediate and offers a little bit more of a compromise, a bit more compromise in the way we approach it. And so it's a different philosophy, and it's not an uninteresting exercise.
Mm. You talked about vintage. Someone asked about 17. I guess we can just go back to the 17 real quick. What do you think of 2017? How do you like it?
I like it a lot. 17 feels, when I taste those wines, it feels familiar. It's the kind of it feels like the kind of vintage that we had much more often in the 80s and 90s. So cooler summer. It was an early harvest and it got ripe, but we had to wait for it a little bit more, and it was not as tannic. It was not as extractable as the really hot vintages we've had in 1918 or 16 or 15. And so there's a bit more delicacy. It doesn't compress the hierarchy and doesn't feel as vintage dominated as a vintage like 15 did. When you taste the 15, as you said, it's a strong village, and you recognize 15 first, and then you see the village or the producer. In 17, you see, I feel, the vineyard more through those wines. So I like that character a lot. And they're not going to take forever to come around, which is kind of nice, because the 15s, to really get the full experience, it's going to take a long time to happen.
Yeah. I mean, as a wine merchant who sells, both to the trade and private, 17 is a vintage that is more approachable, and it's easier, and it works very well in a restaurant or bar, or on-trade setting.
Or someone who doesn't have infinite storage or patience.
Exactly, that too. But 15, is a vintage that needs to be held back a little, even though the Chambolle is drinking very nicely, but it'll benefit from quite a bit of aging. So sure. It's I would say it tilts more towards the private client sales side with a vintage like 15 and 16. Mm-hmm. We'll know about 18 soon, because I mean we're in a slightly different market situation here.
It's and there's no question that it also depends on the age of your client. What can I say? When you drink your wine.
No, but I must say
that wines are drinking that are 40 years old. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, in 40 years I'll be 84 years old. Will I even still be alive or drinking, or let alone? So anyway, it's time to stop buying wines that require 40 years in the cellar.
But would you say that your wines are more approachable these days than, say, your father's time, or?
No, I think actually the reverse, which is funny. I would have thought with riper vintages, the wine would be less immediate, but or would have been more immediate. Sorry, but actually I think with the warming we get thicker skins, and with the skins we get more tannin, and so we're making wines, and the tannins also buffer against oxidation. So I think if anything, we're getting wines that take longer to come around than they used to, even though we're really not deliberately trying to go for that at all. But it's just how it goes.
Right.
I saw someone was asking how many years before getting to the peak of 15 and 16. I said Grand Cru level, 25 to 30 years tends to be a good rule of thumb for peak level. So that's still a ways away. For Village, around the 10-year mark is usually pretty good.
Good.
Also saw someone, let's see if some of the other questions. Is work still going on in the vineyards? Yes. We can't. They don't stop growing because we've stopped. So, and unfortunately, it's pretty straightforward to put together distanciation and things like that in the vineyards. So our workers take their own cars and work at a distance from each other, but work is still going on. We're currently, or this week, we started shoot thinning and debudding. And we were pruning until about 3 weeks ago, and still attaching things and also repairing. And then bottling was a little trickier to manage, but we're still working the vineyards, and we're not going to stop anytime soon. And the government's been quite understanding that agriculture needs to keep going. There's no stopping it.
There's an interesting question from Antoine Proudhon. Which vineyard do you prefer spending time in?
I'm kind of partial to Malconceau because I was there when we bought it, and I'm not sure when I'll ever get to buy a vineyard again, but that was really exciting. And also it feels like a really nice neighborhood. It feels like living on Victoria Peak almost, or something like that.
Any parcel you have the dream to work with? I lost you.
Oh dear, you're on the car. I'm just leaving the house. It's Diana.
Oh, Diana is joining us, seems like. What happened?
I think that works. Someone's asking, what is my take on whole cluster fermentation of warm vintage? I think it works well in both warm vintages and cool vintages. In warm vintages, it can bring a certain mintiness and freshness in the aromas. On the other hand, you can lose a little bit of acidity because the stems contain a bit of potassium, which precipitates your tartaric acid. I like it, but it doesn't work in every vineyard. And it's partly a factor. I do a little bit of consulting in California, and I find that in the places that are reliant on irrigation or irrigate a bit too much, there's such a thing as too much irrigation for a whole cluster. You have to be pretty close to dry farming and to not too much water availability for the vineyards for them to really move into that reproductive cycle and do well with whole cluster. So once you've got that going, then I think it can work in all sorts of vintages. Let me see what else was there.
Did you realize Diana joined us for like 30 seconds while you were talking?
I did not notice that, but she is already spending 24 hours a day with me, so I'm guessing that that's why she did not decide to listen to me, take a little break.
Okay, question from Ronnie Lau. How long would you suggest to breathe the Chambolle Musigny 15 before drinking?
I would, in a decanter, maybe 3-4 hours. In a wine glass, I wouldn't hesitate to pour out a little bit and give it, half hour, 45 minutes. I think that would do it some good.
So you would recommend decanting or not?
15, I think 2015 you can go for it. There's no danger of decanting, and there's probably mostly upside. So yeah, I would recommend it. Not every vintage, but 15, yes. 18 as well. 2012, not the Damodes, but the other wines, yes. Oh, we didn't really talk about the Damodes.
Yeah, now we can move on to Damodes.
Okay, let's do that. So in 2005, the year we bought the Malconceau, we also, as part of that whole vineyard deal, we had some Torre, which we never released, but I made a little bit of Nuits Saint-Georges Premier Cru as a trial. And I'd always thought that it wouldn't really work with the style of the Domaine. And actually, it did work, but it was too late. We'd sold that vineyard. So I'd had it in the back of my mind that if something came up, the opportunity to make some Nuits Saint-Georges again, I would do that. And so a grower that we knew had some fruit for sale in the Damodes, and we started that. So the first vintage I think was 2010, and the last vintage will be 2018. And I like the grower a lot. To be honest, the site was not fantastic, and in 2017 we declassified the wine to Nuits Saint-Georges Village and released it under the Village label, but it all came from Premier Cru Damodes. It makes a surprisingly light wine. I think it's a bit atypical for the rest of Damodes because that vineyard or half of that vineyard is planted over a real clay pocket and with more water availability. And someone was asking about the whole cluster treatment. As a result, we destem more on the Damodes. I destemmed the entire portion, so roughly not half of the surface, but almost, about a third of the volume I declassify because I destem because because it's got more water available, and I don't think it does as well with whole cluster. And so it's a wine that's very different from the other wines that we make. It is more peppery, it's more floral than most of the other wines we make, and it always stands out. It's also lighter in color. That particular part Damodes does not make for a whole lot of tannin. And so I think of all of the wines we're tasting today, it's easily the most forward and most approachable. On top of that, it's got a few extra years on it. But it's light, pretty, and very Pinot, I think.
Yeah, I think the color is also showing it. It's a little bit more advanced than the rest. I mean, it is the oldest.
Yeah, let's go.
So 18 is the last vintage. And what about the 17 Nuits Saint-Georges that you make, the village?
So that's Damodes, and that we declassified. It felt
completely
100%.
Okay, so there's nothing else in it.
Nothing else in it. We could have labeled it Premier Cru and sold it as Premier Cru, but it felt a little bit. It felt really very light within the context of the vintage, and it felt like people would have expectations if we labeled it Premier Cru that would imply a wine with more substance and more weight, and we didn't feel that it quite matched, and so we thought it would be better to drop the price and sell it as village.
Right. Okay.
It's not a decision we take lightly, but it felt the right thing to do.
Question from Sabrina. You are certified organic. Is there an aim for biodynamic as well?
So in order to say that you're organic, you have to be certified in France. Otherwise, people can land on you and accuse you of fraud. There's no such requirements for biodynamic. And to be honest, I don't think that we will ask for biodynamic certification, because while for the reds we would be comfortably within the copper sulfate levels used in the vineyard, we would be comfortably within sulfur levels. For the white, there are some years where our sulfur levels might be a little high, and I don't want to put that kind of pressure on us. And we're going to do what we think is right for the wine without trying to fit in boxes too narrowly. So the organic works, and the biodynamic we think is as a nice extra to do in the vineyard, but in the winery I think they get a little bit too truculent in terms of what they ask you to do. And I think biodynamics makes much more sense in the vineyard than the winery.
And with all the Negos wines that you make, are most of the vineyards or all the vineyards organic?
With the Negociant wines, most of them will be organic starting this year, but up till now, no. We only have the Gevrey Chambertin that was organic. In 19, the Nuits Saint-Georges was organic, and then the Morey and Chambolle were missing. But now the Chambolle and Morey will also be organic. They won't be certified though, unfortunately, but they will be farmed organically. Okay.
Let's see. How to identify whole cluster in tasting in terms of aroma and texture?
Experience. You just have to try a lot. So that's one way. But otherwise, I always recognize the kind of sappiness, sappiness and spiciness. So there's a you can find maybe a bit of minty, menthol, cinnamon stick, maybe. Those would be aromas, and then in the texture, there's a slightly grainier side to whole cluster ferments usually. Not always, but there we go.
There's a joke from Vietti, I guess, another inside joke. How much dolcetto do you use?
Well, because I know my colleagues from Piedmont have a hard time selling through, I'm considering starting a line of dolcetto in Burgundy, which we will call Tarzanello. I think would be the way to go.
09 or 10 if you have to choose across the Côte de Nuits.
Ooh. My instincts would be to say 10 because everyone at this stage is rating 10 higher, and of course I'm French, so I'm a little bit contrarian, so I can't just go out with the mainstream. But also the 9s have been tasting really delicious of late. I think much more so than the 10s that I've had. So for right now, I'd probably go with 2009. For later, I would first impressions matter, and so I'll go with 2010 for the long term. That would be my hedge.
A lot of the '09s seem to be, quite forward and luscious in terms of style, and they lack a bit of complexity. How are your '09s tasting?
So there's this. Initially, everyone was excited about the vintage. Then everyone's then on Burgundy boards, people really geek out, and really there was this fear of overripeness that was born out of 2003. And so people started saying, oh, '09s are like 2003. And I can see how '09 whites are kind of heavy and not joyful. But the reds are a different thing. And I think that '09s, provided the yields were not, I think they're going to be great with time. And they can be a little monolithic. They can lack a little bit of detail. But the '99s were super monolithic and closed for a really long time. And I think that '09 actually shares quite a lot in common stylistically. So I think there's a lot to like in that vintage. And the ones I've tasted recently, if you give them, I don't know, half an hour, and a decanter or something, they're really pretty great.
Mm. Okay. From Igor Baron, do you consider your wine show reductive notes sometimes? If so, how do you control desirable levels of reduction? Very technical
So
here.
they do show reductive notes sometimes. I'm not the most sensitive to reduction person out there. It's very hard to manage precisely, because you can have a wine that doesn't smell reduction and you put it in bottle, and then it's a much more reductive environment and it goes really strongly reduced. So it's a hard thing. We try to anticipate on that, and we try to manage it through the lees and through the élevage, and to make sure that we get to bottle with enough oxygen that the wines do not feel too reduced in bottle. But sometimes we miss. There's no question.
From our colleague Alan, will you consider using screw cork?
No, in short. I think actually that ties in well with reduction. I think that in order to have a wine be successful under screw cap, you really need to have a wine that does not have strong reductive tendencies, or you will end up with wines that are reduced forever. And so I don't think our wines are suitable for that. And then there's other reasons as well, but that would be one of the main reasons from a quality standpoint. There's also some questions concerning pruning and canopy management. So we prune following sap flow. So now the biopulsar technique, that's gotten quite a lot of airtime with Simonette and Cirque, and we work with a guy called François Dalle from the Sicavac in Sancerre, was the one who led us in that direction. So we've been doing that for a few years, and we've had really good results in terms of vine fertility and spacing and not having too much disease and minimizing woodborne diseases. And so that's been really good. And Icy's asking thoughts on non-hedging, and I just don't think we're set up for it. And I'm not ready to conduct that trial quite yet. I know it's very fashionable right now in Burgundy, but I'm not convinced that this is where most of our efforts need to be going right now. But we can only handle so many projects at once. Okay, let's see.
From Eric, what's the best vintage for you, Jeremy? Going back to vintage.
Well, for the very long term, I think 16, 15, 2010, 2009, 2005, 99, 85, 78, 69 would be the kind of going through the history of the Domaine. Those would be the most striking ones. And then for drinking now, I think recent vintages, 2011 is actually starting to taste surprisingly enjoyably. I was not super upbeat about that vintage. 17, 14 would be also good vintages to drink on the younger side. And And then I think there's a bunch of vintages that will surprise us, that we haven't realized yet how great they are. Things like 2013, I think, at the upper end is going to be spectacular. And there's a few like that. I think 08.
13. Okay.
Yeah, 1308. I'm a big believer of those for what they'll surprise people, I think, with their complexity and their refinement.
Would you say it's similar to 2008, or it's a better version of 2008?
I think it's a little bit more, a little finer in the tannin, but I do see those two vintages as having a strong kinship. And I think both of those vintages also have a strong kinship with 93, which is a reference vintage in the 90s.
Okay. Question from Vina. You have done some experiments with DM and dropped it. Mind sharing some insights?
So that ties in with the reduction. We were getting too much. Reduction with the DM corks, and it was shutting the wines down. So not all of them, but with Morey Saint-Denis Village White 2012, and we felt we need to have a better grip on what we were doing from a reduction standpoint before we were ready to go back to DM.
Okay. Talk to us about Gary Farr. I don't know why. Ipsos Restaurant. Is that a close friend of yours, Gary?
So Nick and Gary Farr make wine in Australia under the By Far label, and before that, Bannockburn. And Gary did at least 10 harvests with my father, and Nick has done 5 or 6 with me, and they're very dear friends, and they make, well, and of course, there's some sentimentality no doubt enters this, but I think they make absolutely delicious Pinot Noir in Australia, and my favorite Pinot Noir from anywhere outside of Burgundy. And I think they're terrific. I've never met someone who has a more complete, good winemaking sense than Nick. He's the guy to hand over the cellars to the winery if for some reason I couldn't do harvest and Dinah needed help and that sort of thing. Nick would be someone I'd absolutely trust to make Dujac taste like Dujac, and do the right thing. No,
high marks for Nick and Gary. So along the same line, cool producer you like to drink when not drinking Dujac?
Well, I drink very broadly, and I remain immensely curious about wine. But some of you will notice that the Corrados Luca Corrado and Elena Corrado were on the feed a bit earlier, and so I drink quite a few wines from Piedmont and Vietti and Rinaldi and Mascarello and Cavallotto and so on are all dear friends. We spend quite a lot of time. We see each other often, and we enjoy each other's wines hugely. I love the Northern Rhone for red wines, and especially some of the whole cluster guys in the Northern Rhone. So Jamais and Thierry Allemand and Gonon and non-whole cluster Chave, of course, make wonderful wines. And then in Burgundy, everyone you'd imagine, I suspect. But a lot of friends and colleagues, and I'm always happy to drink their wines. And my tastes are quite diverse, provided it's not sweet and boozy, and I'm talking red wine here. And for whites, I drink a lot of white Burgundy, a lot of Champagne, Grower Champagne, and some Loire, and that's probably the dominant areas for white wine.
And what do you think of the trend towards the more, I mean, it's an ongoing trend with the more very, the reductive style of Burgundy. That's, very lean and mean and picked very early. What do you think of those?
And yes, someone said no Riesling. Yes, I do drink Riesling too. But I made the mistake of taking my wife on a trip while she was pregnant to the Mosel Valley, and we drank. We had 3 or 4 tastings a day, and it turns out it's not a good idea if you want to convince your partner to drink a lot of Riesling. She came back and said, we're not drinking Riesling anywhere near again, but we're taking a break. So that's where we're at, but I do love Riesling. When it comes, sorry, I got distracted by that question. What was your question, Paolo?
Reductive style of Burgundy. Okay. Do you like them?
Yes, thank you.
White Burgundies, mainly.
I think they can be great. I think that there's a strong fashion. There's a strong fashion towards whole cluster too. And the wine business that makes a real marketing shtick of we are traditional, we are rooted in tradition, we do things like our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents did, etc., is actually much more susceptible to fashion than it realizes. And I think the the trend towards reduction shows at times a lack of self-awareness of the fact that this is a passion, that this is a fashion. The fashion in the throughout most of the 20th century, all the way to through the 80s at least, was towards Chardonnay was supposed to be buttery and rich, and sometimes had residual sugar, and they'd let botrytis creep in when it was noble rot, and you taste some wines from the top vineyards of Burgundy. If you have the chance to try some of the old wines, they do bear more than a passing resemblance to Sauterne, but with less sugar, obviously. But nonetheless, you find some of those aromatics. And so I think that we're pushing the pendulum pretty far out in the other direction with tension and reduction. And I think reduction can be a gimmick that hides the character of the wine. And I think that tension at times and minerality can be words that are too easily substituted for greenness and underripeness. And I think there's some producer that do the tension incredibly well and are not underripe and do magical wines. But I think there's people who try to imitate those wines who are perhaps not as skilled in walking that very fine line. And I feel like I want to be a bit more middle of the road for most of my wines. For the whites, I feel like the Montbizon goes towards reduction quite easily, but the two Prunings perhaps a little less so. If it's just enough, it can lend a bit of mystery to the wine. But if it's too much, that's the only aroma you smell. And it's important to have all the rest that makes a vineyard special present, because the reduction is a winemaking trick ultimately. And so we want to not get caught up completely in that.
Okay, we've only got a few more minutes. Let's see. Vigo Gustav, what's your experience with German reds in terms of Pinot Noir?
Very, very light. Very light experience. Sorry. I've tried a few. I've tried a few that were really good. I sold some barrels, some used barrels to Endelé and Moe for a while, and so I got to try their wines, which are really good. I got to try some wines from Bernd Huber. I have not tried those wines in decades, possibly ever, so I'm not sure. But Huber made some very good wines. I thought there were some great wines in Germany. I did feel in some places, some of the Pinots I've had from Germany clearly felt like very hot areas, and I thought that they were a little lacking in depth. But that's probably not the case these days, because I think people have really been pushing the envelope there. So I have not tried Becker. Sorry, I only know the tennis player on that front.
Boris Becker. Okay. My colleague Erica wants me to talk about the four wines. So, I mean, basically, I don't think of Jeremy as tasting all four wines, but four wonderful wines that we have tasted today. It's if I have to pick a personal favorite, I thought this one was it, because I mean the 17s are great and will be great. But at this point, I just find them a little bit young. I should have decanted it, but of course, I'm using this little device here. Normally, I would, open it, a few hours in advance in order to enjoy them. But I find even, from a Coravin, the Chambolle Vizini 15 is tasting extremely well. The Damodes is very much a Nuits Saint-Georges, and it's a bit more angular, but it's, drinking nicely because, it's got more age on it. It's close to dinner time. So what, if with this Chambolle Musigny 15, what would you recommend to go with it, Jeremy?
I really like white meat, so pork, chicken, pigeon, duck. That's not white meat anymore, but birds work really well, and mushrooms also work really well. So I don't know, roast chicken with some fried mushrooms on the side would work well. I feel like your part of the world does pork belly particularly well, and that would probably go well. And I feel like you do duck and chicken very well as well. So I'm sure that you could find something with local flavor that would pair magnificently. Actually, I've eaten it in your home, so I know you would. But
well, thanks everyone for joining, and of course thanks to those who purchased the set of Dujac from us. And someone mentioned Jay-Z, and that's the one reason why a lot of people are following Dujac. It's the one and only. We have Jeremy here with us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us in the last hour. And I hope this COVID-19 will go away from us soon, so that we
Yes, we
can
can pray
start
together. That'd be nice.
visiting each other. Exactly.
Thank you, everyone,
So
for joining us. I enjoyed
thank
this
you,
immensely.
and say hi to the family.
We'll pass on. Same to you on your side.
All
Have a good
right.
bon appetit, everyone, for those who are having dinner
Thank
right
you.
now.
All
Thanks
right.
a lot.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.